Thank you. We've had quite a few mentions this morning of not business as usual, and just before we broke with taking the people with us and the need for ways by which the voice of the community could be introduced into decision making. And the City of Melbourne has, in the last year or two, gone through a process of participatory budgeting called the People's Panel, looking at their financial planning for the next 10 years. And to describe how that's happened and what the process has been and where it's going in the future, could you please welcome Stephen Mayne. Stephen is probably well known as the proprietor of crikey.com and as a shareholder activist, and has a long history of working for the underdog. So could you please welcome Stephen Mayne to discuss the City of Melbourne People's Panel. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks very much, John. Welcome everyone to the City of Melbourne. I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners, the people of the Wurundjeri Nation, and their elders past and present. We had a very exciting exercise over the last year, the People's Panel, and I have to say at the outset that it's been an absolute thrill to be involved, and it's gone really well, and we really hope that it becomes a bit of a catalyst for more governments at all levels embracing this model of decision making. We're in an environment, I think it's fair to say, where the level of trust and confidence in elected officials is pretty low, and our experience from this process has been that you can break down that trust deficit with a really well-informed citizens' jury on a difficult decision. One of those intractable decisions that we all face. If you go out to a panel and you let them deep dive and you inform them, then what they come back with has real credibility and is easier to implement with that credibility. So I'm just going to take you through today our experience, how we did it, and I'll leave a good sort of 10 or 15 minutes for questions. I'll keep it reasonably brief because I know the Q&A is often quite interesting in this area because it's a sort of uncharted waters in terms of the scale of the project that we attempted at Melbourne. So the authorising environment for this exercise was the fact that we set out in our 4-year plan that we aspired to be the most open and transparent council in Australia. So it was that transparency piece combined with a very strong determination to step it up in terms of community engagement. So a combination of really wanting to do new territory and community engagement plus wanting to be really open and transparent. We obviously had to attempt something in the citizen jury space. So once we said that, we couldn't leave the citizen jury model alone. We'd seen Canada Bay, we knew it had been tried elsewhere. We had to get into the space. So the question then became, what topic would we go with? And we had quite a debate internally about that. And in the end, we went for what became the biggest ever topic attempted in a citizen's jury, which is the creation of our 10-year financial plan. And this was actually first suggested by our officers, which was a great suggestion. It came through the Finance and Governance Committee. And one of the reasons I think it came up was because we hadn't done a 10-year financial plan before. So we were giving the citizens' jury a blank piece of paper. So there was no existing officer or council position under threat that could be knocked over or embarrassed or changed because it was a blank sheet. And therefore the jury who came in also knew that they had credibility and they had power because they were starting. They were doing the first draft of history here in terms of this process, and that really energised them because our first attempt at doing this is a response to what the citizens' jury suggested that we should do. So we presented that we had a strong financial position. We had net cash. I think only the City of Sydney was in a stronger financial position of any government in Australia. It was a 10-year plan though, so how do you really project what your position is going to be in 10 years? And we didn't really know. The officers, the councillors hadn't really sat down and said whether we had a massive infrastructure backlog or not, whether we could continue to sustain our position of having had the lowest rate rise of any council in Victoria over the previous 15 years, the only Victorian council that hadn't been ahead of CPI over 15 years. And so we presented, we had a starting strong financial position, but the key internal debate we had was, are we presenting that there's a problem or not? And in the end, our CFO did present at the outset that there was a problem, and that was, he came up and said there's a $900 million funding gap. That if we look long term with all our commitments in open space, structure plans, we've got a lot of urban renewal areas. We're spending $250 million in renewing the Queen Victoria market, which is about double, which is about 2 years' worth of capital spending. So that's a very big proportion of your slice. And we were very reliant on parking, so $100 million a year in parking versus only $60 million in Sydney. And we were very underdone on developer contributions. And we'd had these low rate rises over 15 years. So we hadn't been chasing the revenue particularly, but this backlog of infrastructure spending and the need to spend more, particularly as City of Melbourne was becoming the fastest growing council in Australia in terms of population growth last year at 11.5%, we have some big spending challenges. And the officers came out at the front and said, we're $900 million short over 15 years. Interestingly, the Lord Mayor came out in the middle of the process and said, you've been snowed by the officers. I disagree with that figure. And that was an interesting exercise. And that was the beauty of the exercise, because it forced everyone to take a position. I mean, you can never be exact on where you're going to be in 10 years. You can't be. But we said, officers, you have to come up with a position. They did their level best. Lord Mayor contested it. That was all part of the fun and the debate of the Citizens Panel. It teased out so much new information from both the elected reps and the officers and external experts who were called in. So we talked about these drivers, technology disruption, economic uncertainty, urban renewal, climate change. I mean, it's over $100 million to fully flood-proof South Bank, over 20 years. It's a big spend with climate change and sea level rise and storm surge and these sort of issues. So we presented on these drivers to our panel. We asked a specific question, which is there on the screen, the top bit: how can we remain the most livable city in the world whilst addressing our challenges? And then the subset question, which was the controversial one, is how do we close this $900 million shortfall? We then embarked on, as it says there, on the biggest community engagement process in the history of the City of Melbourne. It wasn't just our jury. We went out, and Ian Walker will present next from New Democracy, and he'll tell you more of this detail, but we went out randomly, genuinely randomly. We demanded that we reflected our demographics. We made a key decision early on, which was 50% business and 50% residential. Now, the federal seat of Melbourne is the most left-wing seat in Australia. So if we just said only residential as a capital city council, we would have got a very different cross-section than if we said 50% business, 50% residential. Interestingly, we didn't represent any workers or commuters. So people who drive into the city or people who ride into the city, we didn't put them on the panel. We stuck with our property franchise and skewered at 50-50 business residential. That was an important decision in my view. There's a picture of our panel, as you can see, diverse, quite young. We are a student town. 42% of our residents in the City of Melbourne are students. So we are a very young student town, and our panel, and very diverse, and our panel absolutely represented who is in the City of Melbourne. We didn't just do the panel, we did workshops and pop-ups and discussion groups, and we had an online budget simulator. So we presented our 43 with all of this data that came from this other participative process that we fed into our experts. Then, as you can see, the panel met 6 times, August through November last year, all day Saturday. Every single one was a sunny Saturday, and they all turned up. I mean, we all said, Ian was said, we'll start with 43, and we've just got to finish with at least 30. You will have drop-offs. And we had people ringing in from hospital after having chemo. We had all sorts of amazing participation, and literally no one dropped off. They stuck with us for 60, 70 hours of their time. They loved the deep dive. And by jingo, was it a broad topic? I mean, $400 million a year budget, 10 years, $4 billion, all the diversity of over 100 services, world's most livable city, fastest growing council in Australia, This was a very big question. And that was probably the risk, that we threw open such a huge topic to people who'd never been engaged with council previously. So that's just an image of our online simulator where we got people to jump online and move the dial on different areas of spending as to where they thought our priorities should lie. They made 11 recommendations in the end. We gave them a budget of $150,000, as you can see there. The 11 recommendations came to council in November. We initially said that we would have it back by April. That has slipped somewhat, and we're expecting to release it on June 30 with the final budget. So it'll go out 5 days before that when the council agenda appears on the web. And so we haven't yet released it. So I can't actually come out and say we've adopted all 11, every last step of it. But I can say that there's already been a number of examples where we've shifted the policy dial in line with some of the recommendations that came out from the panel. I've just noted there that the panel were, very importantly, we obviously served up our first pack of information, presentations from key officers, so Rob Adams and our CFO, and then we let them ask who else they'd like to hear from. So they said, we want to hear from Bernard Salt. So Bernard Salt came along and talked about all the demographic challenges. We want to hear on climate change. So Professor Graham Pearman came along and presented on climate change. We want to hear on planning. Now, the planning minister said no, but we had a representative from the Metropolitan Planning Authority come along and present on all these new skyscrapers and population growth and infrastructure challenges around planning. So that is the key, is that you have to give them a certain level of information to start with, and then you hand over the power for them to request more documents and more presentations to better inform their deliberations. And they made a lot of requests. They called back several of our officers on multiple times. The councillors had a go. So we all got one session where we had we broke up into small dating circles, and we had 3 minutes with each group, and we went around and we gave our spiel. And I used that, for instance, to say, we should sell citywide. I hammered it really hard. A very good example of an excellent shared service model, by the way. Citywide, which runs separately with an independent board. It's not a monopoly. It's a challengeable service. It's done a great job and returned us over $100 million over the last 10 years. As Chair of Finance, I was saying sell citywide. They came back and said, don't sell citywide. A complete and absolute emphatic rebuttal of my position, and that position is now politically dead. I've dropped it. The People's Panel killed my plan to privatise citywide. And that's an example of the power. I knew the only way I'd get that over the line would be to get the panel to say do it. They said no, I've given up. So it does have a lot of authority. Again, this is more information. We've got sort of 5 service streams. We regulate, we design, build and manage assets, we advance Melbourne, we activate Melbourne, and we deliver community services. Interestingly, they absolutely wanted us to maintain our very strong spending on activating Melbourne. So, the 3 million on Moomba and the 3 million on Christmas decorations and all the events and all the community services. There was no suggestion at all that we should do any cutting in any of those areas where we do spend a lot of money. Again, I've already referenced the fact that they were able to call in the experts. The rate modelling question, we had a lot of debate back and forth about all the different triggers with the rate modelling. We have a pretty plain vanilla rate system based on net annual value, NAV, and we have a 17% loading for business. So a 17% differential, which is pretty modest compared to some of our neighbours. They asked for information on condition ratings of our buildings. They wanted to know more about why we were so undercooking developer contributions. And we've done probably 40 to 50 million in 25 years in developer contributions at the City of Melbourne. City of Sydney does 50 million a year. So, and Brisbane's sort of up around the same amount. So we were massively undercooking developer contributions relative to other capital cities. And on Tuesday night, very much in my mind, with the support of the panel saying crank up the developer contributions, we unanimously passed a $20 million a year open space levy regime after a 2-year process. And my view is that if we hadn't had the backing of the panel, we wouldn't have been able to come up with a recommendation that said from our officers, no, go harder than what the independent planning panel has told you. So it went off to the independent planning panel. They came back and said a certain model. Our officers said, no, go harder. We unanimously supported that. And I think that may not have happened without the imprimatur of the panel saying you're underdoing developer contributions, you've got a revenue shortfall, push that button and bring in more from developers. So we got our 11 recommendations. It came back to us in November last year. We agreed to give obviously thorough consideration. We've ordered the officers to embed all 11 recommendations into our 10-year plan. And if they don't apply it, then they are to explain why not. So when the document comes out in 3 or 4 weeks, that will be absolutely embedded. And a couple of other examples of where we've already applied it was when the officer position came through with the budget, the officers said, put them up by 3%. And the panel said, put them up by 2.5% above inflation for 10 years. In other words, the panel said, do a 30% real rate rise over the next decade because you've got this big funding shortfall. So the officers came back this year's budget and said 3%. We went back and said no, 3.6. So the councillors said no, do a higher rate rise. And we reallocated that money mainly into more solar on our buildings and faster replacement of LED street lighting. And that was a very strong recommendation from the panel, which was to really crank up and push on the sustainability front. So officers said one thing, councillors intervened, higher rate rise, reallocation, completely in line with the panel recommendation on the sustainability front. Interestingly also with motorbikes, our motorbike policy came in 3 or 4 weeks ago. The panel said specifically, get the motorbikes off the footpaths, but accommodate more efficient transport means, particularly cyclists. And so the officer recommendation came in. Again, councillors intervened, get rid of 20 paid car parks and turn them into free motorcycle corrals for parking and do it in the next 12 months. Get on with it and do it now. And it's an extra 120 motorbike spots for free in 12 months. Bang, delivered on the council chamber floor, again, in line with the panel recommendation. So it is already informing and in driving small decisions, and the proof of the pudding will be probably in 3, 4, 5 years as to how much we have actually implemented. Because it's not a specific decision, it's a whole massive picture. And so you can't just say, yes, we've completely implemented everything. It will always be a degree. But as Chair of Finance, I really want this to succeed, and I'm certainly going to be looking to have maximum adherence to the panel's recommendation. One, because I agree with it, and much of it also supports many of Council's current settings, but is allowing us to go harder on a few interesting points. The most difficult one, of course, is the rate rise, where we do have a low tax, with the business franchise, we do have a low tax position amongst many councillors. And so with rate capping coming, can we come out on June 30 and say 2.5% above inflation for 10 years? That's an interesting question. Have a look at the website on the day and see where we land on that one. We got great media, unbelievable media, huge feature in The Age, supporting the process, interviewing our panellists. There's been 2 or 3 Radio National features. There's another one coming up in the next couple of weeks called Big Ideas. Yes, we got the Herald Sun and 3AW coming after us in the first 24 hours on this idea of, a bit like Julia Gillard's People's Panel, how stupid for an elected rep to hand over a decision to a bunch of people who know nothing. And we had to get our language absolutely right. So on 3AW I said, no, Ross and John, we want people like your listeners to tell us what we should do, not just the usual squeaky wheels and professional people who always turn up. We want to hear from real people who listen to 3RW. And that sort of neutralised their antagonism a little bit. So I think it's got a lot of upside. It does lead to greater transparency because it does force more release of information, particularly when you hand over that ability to demand more expertise and demand more presentations from experts. It's a genuine knowledge position, so it's a genuine deep dive. As Ian will explain, it's an excellent deliberative process where it's an informed decision Majority does rule, an informed majority does rule, and it's popular with the community. So the Canada Bay Mayor got a much bigger mandate in being re-elected than many of his neighbouring mayors. And that partly reflected community support for the fact that that they'd gone out with a People's Panel on their budget. So I'm certainly hoping that the community there'll be political capital built from politicians brave enough to hand over the power controls to community citizens' juries to give them some excellent advice. South Australia, Joe Retherwall's obviously leading the charge and has had great success with it. The challenge is to keep the costs down per project and for it to be scalable. I mean, I'd love to see Metro Rail. I'd love to see our enterprise agreement have people giving us some input as to what we should try and seek. And that's never been tried on any enterprise agreement in Australia, to actually talk to a genuine jury about what would be a reasonable outcome as opposed to the usual processes that we see in the Australian system. So I think there's a good role for MAV potentially to inform and educate like today, and appreciate very much the opportunity to present, and it's great that Ian Walker's up next because he's the #1 man in Australia in terms of actually delivering these projects. I think MAV could certainly have an evaluation role, a training role and a delivery role if this does get to scale. I'm a huge fan of it, and I'm happy to take any questions from the floor about how all this worked. So thanks very much.
Hi Stephen, Damien Wade from Surf Coast Shire. Really interested in your presentation and the concept. The question is, do you think people's panels are most effective on a task-based project, or you can actually sustain the same panel to review a number of the key strategic decisions that council needs to make, like your EBA? Or do you need to change it over each time, do you think, to focus on that particular issue?
Ian and I disagree on this. Ian's adamant, and as are some of the academics in the space, that you don't rebake or reheat a panel because they become factionalised, they know each other, and the same things that we see amongst elected reps develop. Obviously, it's a bit more expensive and time-consuming to get a new expert panel, but I'm arguing with Ian about whether we could reheat our panel for one more issue. But I think that the argument goes you shouldn't do it. But I can imagine a system where you might have 1,000 people across Australia who offer themselves for regular use in citizens' juries and can be deployed, electronically. I think it's got great upside, but certainly the argument I've heard from the experts is you need that genuine, don't have a current position, not a partisan player, haven't been engaged, to get that real randomness, neutrality and demographic reflection of your entire community.
Chris Woods, Marrickville Council, right next door to the City of Sydney. We put a citizens panel to work about 12 months ago, and we were specifically interested in what they felt about our current level of service delivery and the way that it related to our rate rise, to a potential rate rise, and what strategies we could put in place to improve or even reduce the service level if they felt that that was the way to go. One of the interesting things about the findings of the panel was most councils felt that it was relatively severe. I mean, they had no doubt about recommending a rate rise. They had no doubt about recommending an increase in developer levies. And they were certainly quite big on fines, and that is parking fines. I was surprised about that, and I felt that citizen panels would probably be a little bit less severe on parking fines and so forth. But they certainly responded in the way that the City of Melbourne panel responded, and just generally, I was surprised about their ability to give a lot of hard decisions and hard issues the tick.
Well, I think Marrickville is a certain demographic politically, and I think you probably got back what your community thinks. They're not particularly in favour of cars. Strong Green vote. They want good services. They're not a whole bunch of pro-business small government advocates. They're more into good service delivery and community, and so I think it usually comes back with what your broad community reflects, not what you hear on talkback radio, where it's always a pro-car position because most of their listeners are stuck in traffic, or the sort of the IPA position of slash and burn, cut rates by 20%. I mean, that's actually not, when people have the trade-off decision of services they value and rely on, and they can see what a 20% rate cut would do to those services, they will generally come back with what is a pretty sensible position that will reflect your overall view of your community. And I think you got what Marrickville wants.
Thank you. Yes, commendable process, participative panels, democracy and so forth for the budget from a public panel. I'm still waiting for a participative democratic panel amongst councillors on the council budget. To some extent, the budget is very tightly held by the operating officers of the council. Be that as it may, the $900 million asset gap, I'm not aware of the exact detail of the issue, but we've had a similar asset gap argument proposed in the City of Melbourne, which shifted from being a gap of 300 million down to 20 million a year shortfall, down to 1.3 million a year, down to, on further investigation, down to it's within a few $100,000, we're not going to worry about it. That asset gap, is it mainly on buildings, road infrastructure, or what?
Well, with us, I mean, we've got a lot of urban renewal areas. I mean, Sydney's going on about Barangaroo, which is, 20 hectares. We've got something like 200 hectares in the broader Fisherman's Bend, Arden Macaulay, Eagate, South Bank, Docklands. You know, it's huge. And delivering all that community infrastructure, the curb and channeling, the parks, the childcare centres, that is a big challenge for us, and that's where we can really see. And the fact that we're so underdone on developer contributions, we're going to have to primarily fund that out of the rate call. So I think that in our case, that was the driver. Plus, we have been undercooking it on rates, and you all know the power of compounding on rate rises. If you do a rate freeze in an election year like we did last time, that costs you, 30, 40 million over 10 years the power of compounding. So we had deliberately underdone, but lowest in the state. And I think that the gap resulted partly from that. Peak parking as well. We can't keep on squeezing the lemon on parking. No one's matching us in Australia, 100 million a year. That's we're peaking out there. So where's our growth, given that we've got this record growth, particularly with the urban renewal challenge, delivering open space, very, very expensive with land prices as high as they are. So, but I agree, you have to do assumptions, you have to make assumptions about wage rises in the EA, and of course it's contestable, but we just said, CFO and staff, come up with your best effort, and we're not going to interfere politically or challenge your assumptions. You come up with your best effort, and they did, and we respect that, even if the Lord Mayor challenged it later in the day. Felicity. Ian, I think it was $500, was it? Or?
Yeah, 100 a day, 500.
100 a day, so well under the award. But they weren't volunteers strictly. Yeah.
Hi, Stephen, Jane Tuzo, City of Port Phillip. I just wonder what some of the feedback from participants was, because I think the huge gap we've got in Australia is really anyone taking any interest in the public interest, and I think this is a means hopefully to arouse that.
I think we might have found a future councillor or two from our panel that we've seriously engaged them. They are seriously following us. They loved doing it. They all, they didn't drop off. So they are civilly energised like, no other process could do. Doctors, dentists, barristers, the CEO of Legal Aid, the warden of Trinity College. We had some really interesting people. So I hope that we will get a couple who run, and some of them will make good future councillors. And if you put every prospective council candidate through a 50-hour, 10-year plan process, they'd be a lot more informed than the majority of new councillors who get elected.
Thank you. Robin Holtham from Onkaparinga City Council in South Australia. I know that we would get quite a bit of resistance to this process from some of the other elected members because they feel that they've been elected to do this work and they've got the mandate to make these decisions. So how would you address that situation?
I think you just have to point to the scoreboard and say that it's working in other areas. And Jay Weatherall, your Premier, is probably after Alana McTiernan from WA, is probably the second best elected champion of this model in Australia. And get with the Premier's program would be how I would be pitching it in South Australia. But you have to pick your topic, and it is very good to pick an intractable issue, something that these elected reps are uncomfortable making a decision about. And say to them, we don't really know. We're going to get flogged either way. Let's at least get flogged by a minority, not a majority, when we make this decision. And we'll have more political cover by being able to point to an informed community position. So I think that's the way to do it, is to pick a small issue, an intractable one, and then just say others are doing it, get with the program, run with it on your next election as a platform, and then try and use a mandate from that. Because I think it's politically popular, and I think we need to try and challenge and take on those in power who are resisting this. And I know it is the natural position of elected reps to say, I'm here for a reason, bugger off with your people's panel. So, it's a hard one, but I just think I think the scoreboard is there, and Ian was very persuasive when he presented. I mean, it was a very challenging presentation, and I was probably in a minority that night over dinner saying that was a great presentation. Wasn't it really interesting? There was quite a few, it's all out of rubbish. Our job is to do this. But Ian is an excellent advocate, and there's some really good academics around, like Professor Lynn Carson from Sydney and Professor Jeanette Hartz-Karp from Curtin. We had them in 3 weeks ago for a 6-hour masterclass at the City of Melbourne with about 40 of our staff, a sprinkling of state government representatives, spreading the message. And those academics are very powerful. So you just need an independent third party to come in and present on how it has worked and how it does work well, and that breaks down the resistance.
Yeah, Graham McKenzie, City of Fremantle. The panel made 11 recommendations, so clearly didn't get down to a level of detail, and I'm really interested to know, I guess, how you kept, the level that you actually wanted the panel to stay at. Obviously, the 11 recommendations, I presume, are much more around principles, and the details of the financial decisions are ultimately left with the council to make, project-specific or service-specific type recommendations. But I'm really interested to know how you guided that process.
Well, I don't know, because I was locked out of it. So they could have come up with 111. We didn't know. And I mean, my take is that because it was I think a 75% threshold, I think a few things hit the cutting room floor in day 6 because they didn't get that 75% threshold. So potentially that diluted down the detail because you had to get a super majority effectively. My view would be maybe you want to lower that to 50 or 2/3 or 60, because I probably would have preferred 15 or 20, maybe a little bit more detail. But we got the big picture messages about moving the dial on, a 1% efficiency dividend. Review your property portfolio. Councils always own far too much property, often don't manage our property, particularly commercially. We got told to get on and review the whole property portfolio. We're doing that. Hopefully we'll sell quite a few $1 million worth of property off the back of a panel's recommendation to do that. So, I think that the 75% issue might have been there, but Ian will probably have a different view.
Can we please thank Stephen Mayne?
Thank you
Thank you very much.